Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je commence par présenter nos excuses parce que nous organisons une fois n'est pas coutume ce mardi en anglais, donc je vais basculer en anglais. Today we will begin our discussions with an article published in the latest print issue of Le Grand Continent, written by Nobel Prize winner Daron Acemoglu. It explains that the effects of technological innovation have always depended on the policies and institutional arrangements in place. And we are at a particular moment in time in the development of AI, where the effects on the labor market, democracy and information, and the development of AI itself are hard to understand. So to discuss this, we are pleased to welcome Antonin Bergeaud, who's professor of economics at HEC Paris, who has also been nominated Best Young Economist in France. Congrats, Antonin. Meredith Whitaker, who's president of the Signal Foundation and co-founder of the AI Now Institute. Barry Lin, executive director of the Open Market Institute. You are a major thinker of anti-monopolistic policies, and the Biden administration remember that, the Biden administration took direct inspiration from your books and proposal. And Anne Bouvreau, sorry?
Trump as well.
We will know in the wrong way. And Anne Bouvreau, Special Envoy for the Summit for Action on Artificial Intelligence, co-chair of the Artificial Intelligence and Digital Council, woman chair of the board of directors of the Économie supérieure. And last but not least, Daron Acemoglu, who will join us in 1 hour, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and famously writer for Le Grand Continent. If you want to read his latest contribution in France, you can find it here. So for the first round, I would like to ask you, Barry, what's your opinion on the current development of AI? What should we be looking at? And you, of course, are strongly opposed to the monopolistic concentration of the tech sector. Is this fight lost with Trump?
Well, it's a few things sort of put together there. Anyway, thank you guys for having me. It's a great event. It's a very timely event. And just to be clear, I am I'm a political economist. I am not a technologist. So the way we look at AI is we look at it through concentrations of power. And our basic take on AI is that, it's like most of us experience AI, we play around with chatbots, or it's like we read these stories about these hallucinations or these dreams of the future that are going to be created by this better AI, or these horror visions of the future. And, we look at it more from, there's three corporations that really dominate the data center industry, cloud in the world. And that's Microsoft, and that's AWS, Amazon, and that is Google. And so one of the ways of understanding what's happening with AI is that these existing three corporations are using their control over the cloud computing, over the data centers, to further concentrate their power. So one of the things that we're looking at is just, we have an extremely dangerously concentrated control over the internet writ large by really 5 or 6 applications. And then the 3 of them, maybe 4 of them, are really sort of driving this revolution to further concentration of control. And then I guess the second thing, and then I'll get to Trump, and just this, the second thing that we're looking at is that what's one of the main threats? So obviously further concentration of control, further concentration of political power. But then what you also have is when AI works, what it's doing is it's amplifying one of the great harms of our present business model of these corporations, which is they're designed to manipulate us. These platforms, Google is designed to manipulate how you think, what you buy, what you do, where you go. That's what their business model is for. Same with Facebook, same with parts of Amazon, same with parts of Microsoft. And so what AI is doing is it is amplifying the ability of these corporations to manipulate and track every one of you. So the present structure of the internet, the present harms, social harms, political harms, this concentration, this AI explosion, is amplifying all the existing harms that have already wreaked so much destruction in our society. As far as Trump, well, I mean, to be honest, Biden was not doing a great job with AI. I think, Meredith may have.
Why?
He just, he was doing a lot of work on the structure of the power of the corporations. He just wasn't. There was a lot of. It was one of the areas where his team was perhaps a little bit less powerful, in terms of standing up to the power of the corporations. And then, Trump is basically just let it roll. It's like, what do you want? You can have it. It's just, but what are you going to give me in exchange? So that's really the difference. Is the Biden people tried to justify what they're doing, and Trump just lets it happen.
Meredith, I fear that you will agree with Barry, and this panel will not have a lot of contradiction. But can you explain us what's your position on this idea? Is basically the anti-monopolistic movement impossible in an AI consolidation?
Well, I don't believe in impossibility. So maybe there is some contradiction. Look, I think what Barry is saying is not an opinion. It's borne out by a material analysis and a political economic view of the history of the current tech industry. Which I happen, I've worked in tech at Google since 2006 through 2019. So I was there during a very formative period when AI kind of landed, or this deep learning paradigm reemerged in the early 2010s. And I think you kind of need to understand the history of the platform business model and the commercialization of network computation, or how the internet became a business model in the 1990s. To actually understand what we're talking about when we talk about AI. Because if you go back through a long history of the term AI and deep learning, you can see that as a blanket signifier, AI has meant a lot of things. Many different heterogeneous technological approaches have been clustered under the umbrella term AI over its 80-year history. So why did the deep learning approach, which is one fairly marginal until the 2010s approach to AI, suddenly reemerge as the sum total of what we consider AI in around 2010, 2012? And there are sort of inflection points that were kind of along this history. Well, the short version of this is we had the platform business model. You had companies that were set up per sort of the regulatory rules of the road set in place in the 1990s. There's a longer history there I won't go into, who were incentivized to scale at all costs, sort of a non-regulated form of communications networks, capture the network effect, capture the market, the economies of scale, and incentivized to collect as much data as possible to feed their advertising, surveillance advertising business model. So you have the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazon marketplaces, the Microsoft in another form through enterprise, who at the beginning of the 2010s had the infrastructure, they had the compute already calibrated to store and process large amounts of data because that's their business model, and they had massive platforms within which they had the data, they had the compute, and there were a handful of advances or sort of realizations, I guess, at that moment where they recognized that, this sort of optimus-seeking deep learning, when we pair old algorithms, so approaches from the late 1980s, like backpropagation, Jan LeCun was one of the people who was working on that well before the 2010s, it became newly relevant when you could test those approaches using the scale that existed from these business models. Why did it become popular? Because it was very, very good at optimus seeking within an engagement-driven social media feed. So if you map the progress of AI to the changes in the YouTube algorithm and the concern around, say, radicalization, or why are we being fed different videos that are producing anger or keeping us on the screen, there were AI models, deep learning models, that were first tested within the YouTube algorithm, that were first applied to optimize ad-supported social media, the sort of engagement-driven model. That was the first use, and then the sort of general purpose AI that became kind of the larger AI business model came out of that. So I think we need to kind of reverse that script. Like, AI isn't really the innovation. What we're talking about is a political economic form of market capture based on a surveillance business model and a kind of concentration of power that relies on network effects and that we've known through telecommunication networks forever, that then made AI newly relevant. And this AI has been branded as scientific innovation when in fact it is derived from a concentration of power that is actually not distributed beyond these incumbents who kind of succeeded during the primitive accumulation phase of the commercialization of the internet.
So
anyway,
maybe we have a contradiction with Anne. Do you agree with this understanding?
I agree with the fact that artificial intelligence has been used since it's a word that has more than 70 years, almost 80. And yes, it's a mot valise. It's something you can put so many ideas and you can fantasize with artificial intelligence. So yes, we put a lot in that.
Very good marketing.
It's very good marketing. I also agree with the concentration of power. But what I want to say is maybe move a little, because I think we will all agree with Darren in what he will say later, which was published in Le Grand Continent, is move to what is it that we can do. And I'd like to say two things. The first thing is a little bit of what we did at the AI Summit in Paris in February. And the second thing is what we discussed recently at the Vatican on the subject of AI. At the AI Summit in Paris, we really tried to push a narrative of AI as not a lost cause and not something that is only being developed by the US and China. Because Barry is right, there's 3 big players in the US and a few others like OpenAI and Anthropic and Grok that also play around them. But it's also true that in China, there's 3 or 6 players and they some of them like DeepSeek are standalones, but some of them like Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent are more like the Microsofts and Google and Amazon. So we really tried to push the narrative that AI is not necessarily just that, and that we need a third way to develop AI with AI development in Europe, in France, in Europe, in Canada, in other countries, because otherwise we're just saying we will let this be developed and manipulation will continue and concentration of power will continue and this narrative resonates in Europe, resonates in Canada, in Japan, etc. So we need to try and see how much we can go in this direction. And the other thing I'd like to say is about the Vatican. I've been going for almost 10 years to very interesting, they're called Minerva Dialogues at the Vatican, with a number of people from tech and from Silicon Valley, with a number of people from the Vatican, and with other people like me, because I'm not from the Vatican and I'm not from Silicon Valley, and thinking and discussing about what AI means. And I was particularly heartened this year by the fact that the new Pope, and this is also something you can read in Le Grand Continent, chose his name in relation to AI and in relation to the previous industrial revolution. And so if you look back at the previous Leo XIII, this one is Leo XIV, he wrote, or his team wrote, after lots of consultations, a paper which is called Rerum Novarum, which means on innovation or on new things. It was at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and the diagnosis that they made was that on the one hand you had people saying that, well, first you had lots of poverty in the working class, and you have people saying, well, that's the way it should be, and we should just continue on the capitalist side, and then you had communism saying we should abolish private property and really make away with this. And the Church, the Vatican and the Church chose a very interesting middle ground and said, yes, private property is good because people who work should be able to enjoy the benefits from their work, but it is absolutely unacceptable that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few people. And it was really very similar to the current situation. And it is not okay to just have a class of workers that are becoming like slaves. So they were very clear in the discourse. And this was the beginning of unionization, of the role of governments in providing social baskets, social care, and things like that. So the fact that the new Pope chose his name and probably wants to do something around AI, I think is very good, because that would be one of the ways we collectively can move in a direction that's more favorable for society and for people.
That's the optimistic side. The pessimistic side is that the Pope is the only one who wants to regulate AI right now.
And he's not a regulator.
I mean, he is the regulator. Let me disagree on that.
With a big R.
Antonin, so we will try to, in order to move forward, I think there is today a very big debate about AI, an AI bubble. And there is a kind of contradiction between the idea that AI will be leading the new industrial revolution and at the same time creating a new bubble. So can you try to explain how to navigate between these two different ideas?
Okay. Hello, everyone. So I think the okay.
Yes, yes.
So I think it's not a question that is unrelated to the previous one, in the sense that the reason we think AI might be a bubble is that we see, especially in the US, a kind of overinvestment into AI. And that's such an overinvestment that most of GDP in the US right now is driven by investments in data centers and in AI models and other related technologies. And so there's one question, which is the same question that was asked right before the beginning of the third industrial revolution, which is what should we expect in terms of growth from this probably new industrial revolution? And back in the beginning of end of the 1980s in the US, there was this debate looking at the very beginning of the take-up of productivity that could be statistically related to the diffusion of ICT, so information and communication technologies. And then we saw, in the US, they saw the productivity rising, and they could, at this stage, anticipate a huge increase in what we could expect in terms of prosperity, GDP, or growth. And in fact, this didn't really happen. If you look at the long-run economic data in the US, but in many countries it will be even worse than in the US, you see that the growth rate that was implied by the ICT, the information and communication technology revolution, is actually very disappointing. And one of the reasons is exactly what was said before, is that initially, all firms in many sectors started to invest into those technologies. And some did it very successfully, and that of course includes the firms that nowadays are ruling the digital world, like Google and others. But it also includes firms that are outside this sector. And one of the examples that is often used is Walmart that really managed to get more and more market share over the years because it was very efficient in adopting information technologies in its logistics. But then what happened? Because there were no regulation in preventing those firms to take over all the markets, they started to overinvest initially, some disappeared. And then in fact, at some point they were so dominant that they didn't really find any incentive to take risk and to continue to invest. And so when firms stop to invest, you do see a decline in growth. And so so coming back to the question on bubble, right now we are basically at the same stage. We do see growth starting to rise again in the US. By the way, this never happened in Europe. There were no wave of productivity in Europe in the ICT revolution. And there is right now no increase in GDP that we see in Europe. But in the US, you do see basically the same taking up of productivity. So there's one question of will we be facing the same issue? And that will be quite worrying in the sense that right now all the investment that are coming through AI, all the market values that is fueling those AI companies, and all the capital that is invested in startups that are building AI models and AI applications, they are betting on the fact that this will be efficient, this will create growth, this will create some values. And I think this excessive concentration that we may see and already see at the wake of this revolution make us very vulnerable to any bad news that will happen in the capacity of AI. Whenever we will think that AI is not able to generate this wave of productivity and prosperity that we expect, people may immediately react and stop to invest into those companies. And that's, I think, why people worry about a bubble.
You want to add something on that? No?
At any point.
Yeah, please. I saw that you wanted to add. No.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think one thing that needs to be understood about this market that a number of us saw from inside is that there are a number of AI startups. You have Mistral, you have others who can build large models that are capable. But if we look at nose to tail, from the development of a model to market access and monetizing that, you are still looking at an extraordinarily concentrated market where only US hyperscalers have that advantage. So even if Mistral can build this model, the access to market is still licensing it to a hyperscaler in one paradigm, in which you then license access to the, a startup will license access to a Mistral model through an AWS server or through another infrastructure provider. So if you look at who actually controls that access to market, it is those who have cloud servers that you can, license access to and then, basically white label the API of a given model, or those who have platforms into which they can integrate an AI model for like optima seeking, engagement, farming, whatever it is. So you still don't have a complete market in any other place but the US in terms of AI dominance. And I think that is really important when we look at, what is this bubble? Because there are a number of startups, we can look at, name the AI companies, but you scratch the surface, you see actually they're just white labeling GPT. Actually, they've just cobbled together a bunch of open source code, kind of a crappy user interface in front of that. And anytime Microsoft/OpenAI wants to shift the model, wants to shift the pricing, wants to shift the permissions, gets sanctions thrown in front of them by the admin that they can no longer do business with a given company, the rug is pulled out from under them. So when we look at what that concentration of power and that dependency means, we need to be tracking back to that, not just enumerating different companies who have different slices of AI capabilities, but not that nose-to-tail access to development and market control.
So I have a very naive question. Does it work the same way in China?
I don't have enough expertise on the Chinese market, but the two poles of AI dominance are the US, because they invested in the mid-century, kind of trying to beat Russia or beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War by investing in computational infrastructure. They built out networks. And then in the 1990s, a very concerted strategy by the Clinton administration to use soft power to ensure that every other company adopted their standards and their technology, because they learned from managed monopolies of telecom markets that was how you kind of gain control. And then China, who had, the century of humiliation and had a lot of knowledge about what it meant to be sort of puppeteered from outside and close their markets to that kind of soft power. So, and had a large enough internal market to support platforms that were big enough, which other countries didn't have. So there's historical reasons for that polarity.
And you want to add something?
Yeah, I've been in China a couple of times recently. The last time was at the end of July. So China is actually very similar to the US, and it has a number of cloud providers who also happen to be social network providers. So the Baidus, the Tencents, the Alibabas are in a way similar to some of the US players. It also has a lot of innovation on the startup front with the DeepSeeks. You've all heard about DeepSeek or Manus AI. They're also developing their own chips. That's really a big thing, because we spoke about the big three in the US that you mentioned, Barry. The one company that is really, really, really winning the battle of AI and making a lot of money is NVIDIA. And NVIDIA is selling actually all over the world, in the US, in China, in everywhere. And China is actually trying to extricate itself from that dependence on NVIDIA. You also have then at the chip layer a global dependence on TSMC in Taiwan, and that becomes even more geopolitical than everything we've discussed. But in China, you do have a very deep ecosystem, and maybe one last point, so that really that gives, I think, a good example. TikTok, which is a social network that we all discuss. We're thinking about banning it for young people, etc. In China, there is no TikTok. There is another application developed by the same company with a different name, with restrictions in terms of usage for younger people, maximum 40 minutes per day, and with a lot of censorship and restrictions on the content. So it's actually a social media that is focused on scientific experiments and learning, and so very widely different from the TikTok that we see and that we're discussing whether to allow or not to allow. That tells you a lot about the power of how people see things in China for digital and what they want for themselves and what they want for the world.
Barry, that's the question. Basically, how power can shape this form of monopoly. Is it possible? Where is the leverage? Is from the public space, from syndicates?
So yeah, a couple of things.
Organized
First,
work.
yeah, just on the issue of a bubble. Yeah, I mean, it sure. I mean, it does look like a bubble. And one of the things that we do in my organization is we study choke points. You know, and actually one of the first choke points we cut our teeth on was TSMC. So we wrote about TSMC in 2002. First published about the concentration of chips in Taiwan. Took us a long time to work that through. But in choke points, like if you look at the bubble, we may be approaching the end point of the bubble because energy prices in the United States are starting to skyrocket because of the competition between the dominant big three and just regular people. You know, it's like people's electricity prices are going up really fast to the point where people are screaming about it. Water problems all around the world. We're seeing water problems in the United States, even where there's a lot of water, but we're seeing water problems in places like Alabama. But there was a big article about Mexico. So there's this, people are being choked of their water by this. The chips, it's like there's lack of, there's competition now between AI chips and memory chips. So the price of memory chips is skyrocketing, which is creating all these knock-on effects. Regulation of agents. We should expect there to be regulation of agents, of AI agents, because it's actually something people understand. There's somebody with a name who's talking to me. So it actually, one of the things about agents, it actually bundles up all of these different problems, these harms, these threats posed by platforms into something that is kind of recognizably sort of human-like. So it actually makes it easier to conceptualize fixes. So we should actually expect regulation to start to actually maybe move a lot faster when it comes to agents. Every one of these is a choke point on a bubble. So will the bubble pop tomorrow? Will it pop next month? Will it pop within 2 years? Probably within 2 years. And when it pops, it's going to be a big pop. I remember NASDAQ crash, March of 2000, and it's like, it feels a lot like that, but bigger. It feels a lot like, and also what you're also seeing is actually this sort of decay underneath, with poor people in the United States, lower middle class people can't pay their car bills. So you're seeing actually something that feels a lot like 2007, 2008. So the last two crashes, it feels right now, you feel a little bit like 2000, a little bit like 2008. So yeah, so we have a bubble. And the question is not whether we have a bubble; it's when does it end.
Mm-hmm. And what will remain?
Yeah.
What will remain if there is a bubble?
What will remain? Well, actually, the thing is, like, if there's a crash, most crashes actually end up favoring the incumbents. When bubbles pop, it's the rivals, the smaller corporations, the upstarts. They're the ones that get wiped out. Because if you're Google, you have all the money in the world. If you're, if you're Amazon, you have all the money in the world. So one of the things about, and that's actually, so I was at this event we hosted last week in Brussels. One of the sort of most experienced, most successful American tech investors of the last 2 generations, Roger McNamee, he was like, he was saying, from my point of view, it looks like big tech is actually looking forward to the moment when the bubble pops, because their relative power vis-a-vis everyone else goes up after that crash. So.
Do you think this is true, Anne?
No, I agree with that. I wanted to make another parallel with the deployment of broadband and internet bandwidth a while ago, where especially in the US there was very, very clear overbuild, and actually there was a bubble and it burst, but then it enabled a lot of the development that we've been seeing more recently, because there was capacity and ideas of use and services developed after that. And I think we may see a little bit of that from the data center development. But I also otherwise completely agree with your analysis on we need to be careful about energy and data centers. We're lucky in France that we have excess energy, excess electricity production, and also that it's carbon free. So we don't risk in the short term, you never know, but we don't risk with the current data center projects that are there. We don't risk having too much use of energy for data centers compared to for hospitals or heating schools or things like that. But it is starting to be the case in some places in the US. It has already been the case, for example, in Singapore. It's already been the case in Amsterdam. So it's very important to get back to this approach of planning, planification, not necessarily by the state, but collectively, of what will the energy be used for, what is the part that will go for data centers and AI and other things, and how do you make sure that you reserve some of that for your citizens and for just the use that is the primary priority use, or should be, except if you forget.
Meredith.
Yeah, I think it's obvious there's a bubble, right? There's a lot of revenue coming in, but there's no break even. And, you're talking about assets that depreciate.
Break even being
making that money, that black zero. So there's no profit, right? And the CapEx is phantasmagoric, and the promises are getting flimsier and weirder and more addled. And you're seeing, the air is going to the balloon is more taut, but we are not seeing that return on investment. And what we are seeing is just, really strange debt obligations, sort of the structuring of these financial relationships are odd. You have, a recent example would be, not odd, but, self-interested and circular, right? You have NVIDIA investing in OpenAI. How do they invest in OpenAI? Well, there's a lot of chips, then NVIDIA's share price goes up, and OpenAI is then reliant on NVIDIA. That sort of boosts their stock. They make their money back. It's not, I think there was, I don't have the stat in front of me, I would need to check it, but 70-ish%, sort of a number north of 50% of Series A AI investments were made by the hyperscalers, so these big 3 companies, and the investment wasn't in in AI startups. The investment was not in the form of money. It was in the form of giving them access to infrastructure to run and train their models, their own infrastructure, which then inflated their share price. So you're seeing a lot of funny math. At the same time, you're not seeing actual profits or real returns on investors. At the same time, you're seeing the promises that are being made in the market get further and further divorced from the material reality of how these systems work, their actual limitations and thresholds. So yeah, there is a bubble. And on the other side, the part that I don't have theorized clearly is this is also a very valuable geopolitical asset, ultimately for strategic control. And so what in some sense...
What do you mean by strategic control?
I mean, 70% of the global market for cloud infrastructure is controlled by 3 US companies, and there is deep self-awareness of that across the US government and private sector. That is an extraordinary, geopolitical position of sort of, I don't know, whatever I'm sure you have a fancy word for it, right? But like that's command and control, right? And then you have, you can change the tooling, you can change the APIs, you can change the pricing structure, and governments, institutions, all of the AI startups in Europe are still running primarily on this infrastructure, or at least need to access some portions of that infrastructure. How many people had problems yesterday with one or another online service because a portion of Amazon went down? Like, definitely me. I think you guys are too polite to raise your hands, but 30% of the internet went down for a while.
All the readers of Grand Continent, so
yeah.
everyone actually should open.
Yeah, you were all reading paper books, I'm sure.
And that was in North America.
That was in North America, but there's key services that even if you're using European cloud infrastructure, you're probably using the Amazon version of DynamoDB or one of these back-end services that's hosted on Amazon, where the tooling and the standards and everything are maintained by Amazon. So the moat and the sort of hegemonic position of these actors is significant, and that is a strategic position for the U.S. government and the country within which those are jurisdictions. So is the state going to bail them out, and what will actually happen there is a question I don't have an answer to.
Antonin?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that also one of the reasons we are at the situation where we are is that there's been a rush of a lot of firms towards trying to develop AI into only one direction, which is essentially trying to produce those chatbots that should be better than the previous version every 1.5 years. And in a sense, everyone is putting money into trying to improve the technologies in one direction, without even trying to think if this is the direction that customers actually want AI to go through. Okay, it's not so clear that we really want GPT-5. Maybe, we wanted some other application of AI, but a lot of the investment are going towards developing new models, because also there is a lot of concentration here, and only a few firms can do it. And the result is that there is a whole ecosystem that is built around those models that are, as you rightfully said, they are just basically putting an interface in front of ChatGPT, and they don't even sell it at a price that will cover their cost that they pay to OpenAI. So there is everyone is losing money in this value chain, because OpenAI is also using Microsoft servers, and they what they charge to the customer is less than what they pay to Microsoft, that also use NVIDIA chips that they charge less than what they pay, and so on and so forth. So everyone loses money, because the paradigm is that we should go as fast as possible in only one direction, even though we're going to lose money on the short run. And that, I think, in that sense, maybe a bubble can clear the market if we want to get to be a little optimistic. I'm not very big believer of that, because I think, as you said, that after a bubble burst, there is only strong incumbent that remains, and then they are very free to decide in which direction the technology will be. But I think that's also relating to what Daran Acemoglu has written, in the sense that he's also worried that the market might direct the innovation in a direction that is completely suboptimal from a consumer and a welfare perspective. And I think this is what is happening with AI.
Shouldn't we now try to understand? I mean, there is a very naive question there, but if the situation is like that, why no one is acting, and who should act and who could act in order to regulate this new economy? Barry.
Well, every government in the world has regulatory power.
Yeah, but is French power enough to do?
Well, French power in tandem with German power, in tandem with Brussels power, it adds up, So this is a giant market, and if you concentrate your power as a marketplace, your regulatory power, you can affect huge change. But the question is also what are you doing, right? So the thing about regulation is we tend to look at a problem and go, I'm going to regulate AI, right? So, but what is AI? It's AI is a lot of different things, and what are you going to what part of AI are you going to regulate? And or I'm going to regulate technology, but what are you going to what part of technology, big tech, what are we going to regulate? So I think it actually helps for people in this next stage as we prepare for the opportunity to really rethink what's happening here, the opportunity can be created by the various crises that are emerging and that will be blooming in our midst in the next few years, is to reconceptualize how we think about regulation by thinking about what it is do we want as individuals, as a community, as a nation. What is it that we want? And I think, because we've forgotten how to define our wants. It's like, my sense is that what each of us wants is we want liberty. We want control over our own lives. We want our families to have control over their lives. We want our communities to have control over their own lives. We don't want to be manipulated every moment of every day. So, I think rather than saying, how are we going to regulate AI? It's like, we should be thinking, how do we use regulatory powers? And we have awesome regulatory powers.
We being US, being
Europe,
we the people.
Europe and United States.
But United States doesn't really feel like a power right now wanting to regulate AI, or at least wanting to defend democracy in the way you are.
There's a lot of ways to disrupt the president. It's like there will be disruptions. And there's actually a huge amount of. There is a huge rebellion that's brewing in the United States against popular rebellion against the present state of affairs. People are sick of having this machine sort of bringing gambling into their home, bringing gaming into their home, bringing pornography into their home, bringing just all kinds of addiction, bringing insanity into their home, bringing images of assassinations into their home. They don't want that anymore. I mean, it's off the charts, 85% plus. And actually I have friends that do all this polling, all this surveys, and they're like, what do people want? It's like, number one, I don't want to be manipulated. I don't want to be controlled. I want liberty. It's like, we've been waiting for the liberty moment, and it's finally happening. So, how does this translate into politics? Right now, we don't know because we don't have the leaders to do that. But we're going to go out and we're going to make those leaders. But in terms of, again, with thinking, this is the key thing. But it's not. As we approach this, don't think about how to regulate AI. Think about how to regulate power in the political economy to achieve the lives that you want, that we must have. Because that's how. During the revolution here, during the revolution in the United States, people didn't say, oh, how do we regulate the king? They said, no, how do we actually achieve the world that we want, that we need? And so we just need to flip this thing upside down. Once we do that, things will look a lot different, and this is going to be a terrible, terrible period in our lives coming up. But on the other side, if we play this right, we get everything we want.
Thank you, Barry. Please. Meredith, maybe you want to add something, and I will ask you also if you can help us to understand what Europe could do in order to go in that direction.
Well, I plan to have a great life, Barry, but thank you.
But it's a terrible and then great.
Look, I don't, a conservative reading of GDPR, a regulation that already exists, could easily ban surveillance advertising, which would cut off the data flows to the AI incumbents and disrupt this concentration of power. That's right there. Will Ireland enforce it? I don't know, but there is a problem of political will and a kind of save face mentality where people want credit for having regulated without actually pulling the lever. So y'all have to deal with that. I can't solve the issue of political will, but
when
I think
you say political, can you just be more precise? Is institutional? Is political elite? Is more like what the people want?
I am not a politician. I'm not a regulator. I'm not a policy person. I spend my day thinking about developing and maintaining critical infrastructure for private communication. So I don't have the answer to that, and someone on the panel might have a better take on, what is the issue, but I would say there's, a lot of people like to be close to power. Few people want to confront power. It's scary. There are costs, and there's a lot of sort of, trying to walk the two-step of being seen as a person who is willing to confront these things while not actually losing a seat at the table. That said, yeah, thank you, my friend. I think in terms of what to do, I want to narrow it down to sort of a very practical, angle that is very important to signal, which is that there is a massive interest convergence, a massive shared incentive among actors as diverse as human rights organizations, every single government, every single military, in calling the bluff on some of these deployments. Because the way that AI agents are being deployed, the way these AI models and systems are being integrated into critical infrastructure is astoundingly reckless. Basic cybersecurity hygiene is being thrown out the window. Like stuff that would have been laughed out of the room at Google 8 years ago is just passing muster right now because, again, this desperation to find that market fit, to please your investors, to get to that break-even point is driving an incredibly and increasingly reckless set of choices that mean we are undermining our core infrastructures by sticking LLMs, which themselves are not secure. There are a significant number of adversarial attacks. Research from Anthropic just came out saying 250 poisoned documents in any size data set to train an LLM can result in a kind of backdoor that allows you to, basically have a, if you know how to prompt the LLM to have it do something nefarious. Now that LLM, you cannot sanitize a data set that has been scraped from the entire internet. So you have, for the people who are old or watched old movies when they were a kid, like a Manchurian candidate wake word embedded in an LLM that cannot be detected once it's trained. And then you have a bunch of grifters selling access to LLM APIs to our militaries to make decisions in our core infrastructures. Like, we have an interest in calling that out and stemming the bleeding there. We also have an interest in calling out the integration of so-called AI agents, which is sort of a marketing term for, bots that make complex, do complex tasks on our behalf without asking permission, right? And these are being integrated into the operating systems, iOS, Android, Windows, et cetera, at a very low level. And to work, to book that ticket, tell your friends, et cetera, to make a restaurant reservation, they need access to a huge amount of data in a way that is highly insecure. So book a restaurant reservation and tell your friends, well, it needs access to your credit card, needs access to your browser to look for a restaurant, browsing history, needs access to your calendar, all your events, and needs access to, well, your Signal, so they can communicate with your friends. That right there is like a puncture in the security architecture that we have relied on for the operating system, where developers and users trust that these are neutral platforms that will do what we tell them to. We now have those instrumented by AI agents, very, very insecure, taking natural language prompts that are very difficult to secure, data that is almost impossible to sanitize, and that is creating a backdoor in things like Signal, where our encryption no longer matters, because you can just ride on the backs of this agent that has root access on your device to get access to your Signal data, meaning that this is an existential threat to the existence of security and privacy at the application layer, security and privacy that every military, every government, every human rights organization relies on. So, that's not a regulation, but that's just a material analysis that cannot be denied or avoided by anyone with any technical literacy, that I think needs to be marshaled and put forward in a way that, can collectivize that shared interest and stop some of this madness, which is, again, not credible, but has been sort of floated because there is such a desperation, again, to get, some kind of product market fit that almost every guardrail is being discarded by these companies.
Thank you, Meredith. So we have 5 more minutes before Darren Acemoglu. I don't know, maybe Anne, you want to take the
Yeah, I
floor?
wanted to come back to your question of what can we do and to geopolitics. We need to realize that the US is very clearly today on a strategy to sell their services, AI, cloud, everything, to the world. And China has a similar strategy, more geared towards countries from the south, so we see it a bit less. But in terms of us, Europe, the US sees us as a market where they can sell their services. And so the power of Europe to regulate is real, but I think we have overextended this power. We have over-regulated. There's at least 10 different regulations on AI and data spaces and GDPR and etc. We have not been strategic enough to say, these are the 2 or 3 things that we want and that we will not budge from. And Trump is currently using the current bargaining on tariffs and on other things to say, well, if you decide to regulate, I will impose more tariffs or I will put a ban on some of the services that I can offer you. So it is difficult, even if we were more or stronger and more willing to exert our power than we are today collectively. It is very difficult because in front of us there's a government that says, I will just negotiate and I will let my companies just do things as they want in your markets. And why does this matter? Because I think AI brings a concentration or a concentrated form of culture. We're not just getting something that is an economic tool and that brings help on our day-to-day work. It's a concentrated version of what we see in Hollywood. If it's grok, it's a concentrated view of one form of democracy. And if this is not what we like, we need to be able to, one, regulate, but also build our own solutions that are in resonance with what we want, as Barry said. We're not doing enough of that.
Antonin, actually, my understanding is that Diana Chemoglu is running a little bit late, so you have five more minutes.
Okay,
Antonin.
I won't be very long.
Please be a little bit long.
Okay, I will be long. No, I mean, I wanted just to say that one of the reasons a lot of economists are mad at Europe at the moment is that, in fact, I think what Europe need to achieve is to show to the rest of the world that there is a world where we can regulate AI. We can try to prevent the kind of excess that you mentioned with environment, you mentioned with cybersecurity. That requires a lot of regulation, that requires a lot of rules and a lot of some specific markets that I think we have in Europe. In Europe we have some common values that the population mostly share. That is trying to preserve the environment as much as we can. We probably don't do enough, but we try more than elsewhere. Try to protect the consumer a bit more than elsewhere too. The problem is that the way we designed those regulations early on made most of the AI produced in Europe very inefficient, and the market, and we are still in the race, but we are losing to China and the US. And I think it's very problematic because if we cannot show that there is a world where we can have a dynamic ecosystem of AI and produce models that are competitive and produce infrastructure that are competitive while being regulated to prevent all those excess, then the conclusion that everyone will have is that you can choose between being poor or following the pace where you have to forget about data security, you have to forget about your own privacy, and you have to forget about the environment. And it's very important that we struggle.
This is not the choice is not between the two.
I think there is a third way, but the problem is that we are currently not showing the world that this third way is possible. I think it's very important that we find this way. Right now we don't have enough value generated by those new technologies to continue to survive with this set of regulation that we have.
Mardi.
If we have a second on the data security point, which is one that it's sort of my lane. Yes, I think that's absolutely how it's presented, and that's the sort of libidinal force of what we're dealing with. But what we're also seeing is that data security tax is being externalized onto the weakest party. So it is the company that is sort of licensing the AI, or the enterprise that's integrating the agent that is then taking responsibility and ultimately liable for that. So that's a high cost if your customer data gets breached, if your IP gets breached, if every device in your military is suddenly popped, that is an extraordinary cost. And I think what we're seeing is an AI industry that is sort of externalizing that onto the customer or the user in a way that, I would ask the economists to price that in to how we are thinking about the risks here and, that sort of false set of choices.
It was great to hear Barry's closing. I second the hopes. Reality is, we'll see. Well, look, I mean, I think what I want to talk about very briefly is that there is an increasing recognition that technology is a choice, meaning that almost all of the social, economic, and political implications of technology are not simply a function of the nature of technology, whether it's digital versus analog, whether it's AI versus old-fashioned algorithms. And it's not even a function of the pure institutional structure in which new technologies are embedded. Technologies are extremely multifaceted, even more so when they are turned into applications. So starting from the same technological architecture, when you build on it, you can create communication technologies that greatly facilitate surveillance, or you can create technologies that protect privacy and create an environment for the productive kind of dissent. Based on the same digital infrastructure, you can go down the path of relentless automation, or you can try to do things that are more interesting in terms of how they leverage some of the skills that human workers have and see whether you can help them with technologies that increase their problem-solving capabilities, enable them to perform more sophisticated tasks, etc. In all of these regards, I think AI is even more flexible than many other waves of macro innovations, that AI, interpreted as a broad technological paradigm, can go in so many different directions. So early discussions of technology, both in economics and the public domain, have been about the inevitability of technology and a sort of a technological determinism that the only choice is between you either accept technology, and that's the non-Luddite position, and if it has costs, including in terms of inequality, disruption, risks, well, those are part of not being a Luddite. Or you just turn back your back on technology, slow down technology adoption, or reject certain things. I think that dichotomy often misses the point, and I think it does so for AI. The big decision for AI is not whether to oppose the development of generative AI, which will never happen, and accelerationism. It is about what type of AI we want, and I think there are broadly very different directions when it comes to production technologies. AI, I think, has tremendously new capabilities in terms of providing much more useful context-specific information to workers, versus automation and AGI craze. You can go with AI much more in a surveillance direction, or a way of monetizing people's data using digital ads, or you can try to create different platforms for different types of communications that I think are better for humans to human agency and autonomy. So I think those are very big decisions. Now, this next thing I'm just going to say, and then I'm going to conclude, is that, well, we have choice is also somewhat empty. Who is the we and what type of choice? I think we have to be nuanced when we say that. For practical reasons, right now, a lot of choice is in the hands of a handful of companies and Chinese government, perhaps some Chinese companies. So when we say we, that's really the royal we, including those tech leaders. But even the most powerful tech leader, and even the Chinese government, does not operate in a vacuum. Public pressure matters. Public discourse matters. There are liminal moments in politics that things can change. I think, as Barry was saying, the Republicans are a very big tent. Within that tent, for example, there are people who are very willing to go onto a regulatory journey with Democrats on many issues related to AI. Some of it may not be exactly what we may want from first principles, but certainly political coalitions are possible. So I think democratic process is what is part of that. We have choice. And I think a lot of what needs to be explored in the future from a research point of view, what are the feasible and most interesting directions for AI technologies, and what needs to be explored from a political point of view is what type of coalitions can form, and what needs to be explored from an activism point of view is how that conversation can be made more visceral and relevant for the public at large. Thank you. I left some time for questions, but I guess the format did not allow it. So, well, yeah, in 2 weeks. I look forward to it, Meredith. Thanks again for coming. It's great seeing you here, and we'll see you in person. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, everybody.